"She's just some random girl. This will be easy," the tattooed man whispered to his accomplice as they watched the petite brunette walking alone through the dimly lit parking garage beneath Crescent Mall in downtown Riverside. Her designer purse swayed gently as she searched for her keys, completely unaware of the three figures emerging from behind concrete pillars. At 5'4", with delicate features and wearing a flowing sundress, 26-year-old Natasha Winters looked like the perfect target for a quick robbery. But as the lead attacker's fist connected with the side of her head, sending her crashing into the cold concrete floor, he had no idea he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The shopping bag filled with groceries scattered across the ground, apples rolling into dark corners as Natasha's body went limp. Her designer sunglasses skittered across the pavement, coming to rest near a puddle of oil. To the three men standing over her unconscious form, she appeared to be exactly what they had planned for. Another easy mark in designer clothes with a wallet full of credit cards and cash. The tallest one, a man named Derek Hawthorne with arms covered in prison tattoos, reached down to grab her purse with confident satisfaction. "Told you this would be simple," Derek muttered to his companions, Tommy Rivera and Jake Morrison, as they began rifling through her belongings. Rich little princess probably never had anyone even raise their voice at her. They found her wallet immediately, loaded with cash, several platinum credit cards, and an ID showing her address in the wealthy Hillcrest neighborhood. Everything about Natasha Winters screamed privilege and vulnerability. Her manicured nails, expensive jewelry, and the luxury sedan parked nearby all painted the picture of someone who had never faced real danger in her carefully sheltered life. What they couldn't see was the small scar hidden beneath her hair, where shrapnel had grazed her skull during a classified mission in the mountains of Afghanistan. They didn't notice the way her muscles, despite appearing soft and feminine, carried the subtle definition of someone who could deadlift twice her body weight. Her delicate hands that now lay motionless on the concrete had once assembled explosives in complete darkness, performed emergency field surgery, and eliminated enemy combatants with precision that had earned her commendations from the highest levels of military command. For exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, the three attackers believed they had succeeded in their simple robbery plan. Derek pocketed her cash while Tommy grabbed her phone, and Jake kept watch for security cameras or witnesses. The underground garage was perfect for their purposes, isolated, poorly lit, with multiple escape routes. They had chosen their victim carefully, watching her routine for 3 days. Every evening at 6:15 p.m., she parked in the same section, always alone, always distracted by her phone or shopping lists. But as Derek bent down to remove her expensive watch, Natasha's eyes suddenly snapped open with a clarity that should have been impossible after such a heavy blow. Her pupils were focused, alert, completely devoid of the confusion that should have followed a concussion. The three men were so busy congratulating themselves on their easy score that they didn't notice the subtle shift in her breathing, the way her muscles tensed with controlled precision, or the fact that her hands had quietly moved into positions that would allow for rapid counterattack. What happened next would be captured on security footage that police investigators would later describe as the most one-sided confrontation in departmental history. Because Natasha Winters wasn't just some random wealthy woman who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. For 8 years, she had served as Lieutenant Commander Natasha "Ghost" Winters, one of only 17 women ever to complete Navy SEAL training, and the most decorated female special operations soldier in modern military history. Her call sign, Ghost, hadn't come from her ability, to move silently through enemy territory, though she excelled at that. It had come from her reputation for making problems disappear so completely that enemy forces would wake up to find their entire command structure eliminated without ever knowing she had been there. In the mountains of Afghanistan, the forests of Colombia, and the urban environments of classified locations around the world, Ghost had completed 47 successful missions with 0 casualties among friendly forces and a success rate that had become legendary within special operations communities. But 6 months ago, after watching too many friends come home in flag-draped coffins, Natasha had requested discharge from active duty. She had moved to Riverside, bought a small apartment, and attempted to build a normal civilian life. She worked part-time at a local veterinary clinic, took yoga classes, and tried to forget the weight of the weapons she had carried and the faces of the enemies she had eliminated in service of her country. Every morning she looked in the mirror and practiced being ordinary, vulnerable, forgettable. The irony was devastating. 3 career criminals had chosen to attack the one woman in a 50-mile radius who had been trained by the United States military to neutralize multiple armed hostiles in close-quarters combat. They had targeted someone whose muscle memory included 17 different ways to disarm an opponent, whose reflexes had been honed through years of live-fire training exercises, and whose psychological conditioning had been designed to transform fear into focused lethality. As Derek reached for her watch, his fingers just inches from her wrist, Natasha's body coiled like a spring loaded with 8 years of the most advanced combat training in the world. The petite woman in the sundress was about to remind 3 very surprised criminals that appearances can be more than just deceiving. They can be absolutely catastrophic for anyone stupid enough to underestimate what lies beneath the surface. The parking garage was about to become a classroom, and these 3 men were about to receive the most expensive education of their lives. 6 months before that fateful evening in the Crescent Mall parking garage, Natasha Winters had been someone entirely different. Lieutenant Commander Ghost Winters had walked through the halls of Naval Special Warfare Command with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned respect through blood, sweat, and achievements that most people couldn't even imagine. But now, as she restocked supplies at Harmony Animal Hospital on Maple Street in downtown Riverside, she moved with deliberate ordinariness, carefully hiding every trace of the warrior she had once been. At 26, Natasha appeared to be exactly what her new co-workers saw, a gentle, soft-spoken woman who had somehow found her way to working with injured animals. Her colleagues at the veterinary clinic knew her as the quiet one who always volunteered for the most difficult cases, who stayed late to comfort frightened pets, and who seemed to have an almost magical ability to calm even the most aggressive animals. Dr. Patricia Henley, the clinic's owner, often remarked that Natasha had healing hands and a natural gift for veterinary work. What Dr. Henley didn't know was that those same hands had once performed emergency surgery on wounded soldiers under enemy fire, that her calm demeanor around blood and trauma came from years of battlefield medical training, and that her ability to work efficiently under pressure had been forged in combat zones where hesitation meant death. When Natasha gently restrained a panicked German shepherd for examination, she was drawing on techniques learned for subduing enemy combatants, adapted now for healing instead of harm. Every morning, Natasha followed the same carefully constructed routine designed to make her invisible in plain sight. She drove her modest Honda Civic to work, a stark contrast to the military vehicles and helicopters she had once operated. She wore simple scrubs and comfortable shoes, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her makeup minimal and natural. Nothing about her appearance suggested the woman who had once rappelled from helicopters into hostile territory or spent weeks in camouflaged positions waiting for the perfect shot. Her apartment in the Willowbrook complex was a study in determined normalcy. Floral curtains, pastel throw pillows, and framed pictures of puppies and kittens covered the walls where military commendations and team photos had once hung. The only hints of her past were carefully hidden: a secure gun safe disguised as a jewelry box, emergency medical supplies stored behind bathroom supplies, and a go bag packed with survival gear tucked behind winter coats in her bedroom closet. Her neighbors in Building C knew her as the friendly woman who always said hello, but never lingered for long conversations. Mrs. Dorothy Santos from apartment 3B thought Natasha was a sweet girl, probably from a good family because she was always polite, kept her apartment quiet, and helped carry groceries for the elderly residents. James Blackwell from across the hall appreciated that she was low maintenance. No loud parties, no complicated boyfriend drama, no requests for favors or help with household problems. What none of them realized was that Natasha's careful politeness came from years of training in psychological operations, that her ability to assess and remember details about everyone she met was an intelligence-gathering skill, and that her preference for quiet came from a hypervigilant awareness that made her constantly scan for potential threats, even in the safest suburban environments. At the Riverside Community Center, where Natasha attended yoga classes 3 times a week, instructor Amanda Foster saw her as the ideal student: flexible, focused, never missing a session, always punctual. Amanda often used Natasha as an example of proper breathing technique and meditation focus. "Watch how naturally Natasha centers herself," Amanda would tell the class. "See how she finds that inner calm we're all seeking." Amanda had no idea that Natasha's breathing control came from sniper training, where a single irregular breath could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Her ability to remain perfectly still for extended periods wasn't spiritual enlightenment. It was muscle memory from countless hours spent in concealed positions, waiting for targets while ignoring hunger, thirst, and physical discomfort. During her lunch breaks at the clinic, Natasha would often walk to Riverside Park and sit by the small pond, feeding ducks and reading romance novels. To casual observers, she looked like any young professional taking a peaceful break from her day. Children would sometimes approach to ask about the animals at her work, and she would answer their questions with gentle patience, helping them understand how to care for pets and showing them pictures on her phone of the cats and dogs she helped heal. These interactions were both genuine and carefully managed. Natasha truly loved working with animals and found peace in their unconditional trust. But she also used these moments to practice being the person she was trying to become: someone soft instead of sharp, nurturing instead of lethal, predictable instead of dangerous. Every smile, every laugh, every moment of apparent vulnerability was part of an elaborate performance designed to bury Lieutenant Commander Ghost Winters so completely that even Natasha sometimes almost believed the act. But late at night, when the civilian world was quiet and her guard was down, the real Natasha would emerge. She would complete workout routines that would challenge Olympic athletes, practice hand-to-hand combat techniques against imaginary opponents, and clean and maintain weapons that officially didn't exist in her civilian apartment. Her dreams were filled with the faces of soldiers she had saved and enemies she had eliminated, with the weight of decisions that had determined who lived and who died in places most people would never know existed. The transformation from Ghost to Natasha had been complete, methodical, and absolutely convincing. She had created a perfect civilian identity that satisfied every background check, every casual conversation, every moment of scrutiny from people who had no reason to suspect that the gentle veterinary assistant who loved yoga and romance novels, was actually one of the most lethal women ever trained by the United States military. The morning routine at Harmony Animal Hospital began the same way every weekday at 7:30 a.m. Dr. Patricia Henley would unlock the front doors while Natasha prepared examination rooms, checked overnight patient records, and ensured all medical equipment was properly sterilized and ready for the day's appointments. The clinic occupied a converted Victorian house on Maple Street, its cheerful yellow exterior and white picket fence designed to make nervous pet owners feel welcome and comfortable. Natasha moved through her opening duties with quiet efficiency that her colleagues had come to depend on. She restocked bandages, organized medications, and prepared surgical instruments with the systematic precision that Dr. Henley attributed to natural organization skills. What Dr. Henley didn't recognize was the muscle memory of someone trained to prepare life-saving equipment under combat conditions, where a misplaced tool or forgotten supply could mean the difference between saving a wounded soldier and watching them bleed out in hostile territory. The clinic's other staff members had developed comfortable routines around Natasha's reliable presence. Rebecca Martinez, the head veterinary technician, always knew that when she arrived at 8 a.m., the treatment rooms would be perfectly prepared, and the patient schedule would be organized with color-coded efficiency. "I don't know what we did before Natasha started working here," Rebecca often told her husband. "She anticipates everything we need before we even ask for it." Marcus Thompson, the young veterinary assistant who worked afternoons, looked up to Natasha as a mentor figure despite being only 2 years younger. He admired her calm competence during emergency procedures and the way she could instantly assess an animal's condition with what seemed like intuitive understanding. During his training period, Marcus had watched Natasha assist with a complicated surgery on a German shepherd that had been hit by a car, noting how her hands never trembled even when dealing with massive internal bleeding. "How do you stay so calm when everything goes wrong?" Marcus had asked after that particular surgery. Natasha had smiled gently and replied, "I guess I just learned somewhere along the way that panic doesn't help anyone." Marcus interpreted this as natural wisdom rather than recognizing it as the voice of someone who had performed emergency medical procedures while incoming artillery fire shook the ground around her field hospital. The daily rhythm of the clinic provided Natasha with the structured routine she craved, while allowing her to channel her protective instincts in positive directions. When Mrs. Eleanor Davidson brought in her elderly cat Winston for what turned out to be his final visit, Natasha sat with both of them for over an hour, helping Mrs. Davidson process her grief and ensuring Winston's transition was peaceful and dignified. Her ability to provide comfort during traumatic moments seemed natural to observers, but it was actually a skill developed through years of helping soldiers cope with the loss of teammates and the psychological aftermath of combat operations. Tuesday mornings were always busy because Dr. Henley offered discounted services for low-income families, and Natasha particularly enjoyed these appointments. She worked with children who brought in injured stray cats, elderly residents whose fixed incomes barely covered pet food, and young families dealing with unexpected veterinary emergencies. Her patience with anxious pet owners and her ability to explain complex medical procedures in simple, reassuring terms had made her invaluable during these community service hours. During one memorable Tuesday appointment, 8-year-old Sarah Chen had brought in a kitten she'd found behind her apartment building. The kitten had a severe eye infection and was severely dehydrated. While Dr. Henley performed the examination, Natasha knelt beside Sarah, explaining what was happening and answering the little girl's worried questions about whether the kitten would be okay. "Will she be able to see again?" Sarah had asked, tears streaming down her face. Natasha had gently taken the child's hand and explained the treatment plan, describing how the medication would work and what Sarah could do to help during the recovery process. By the end of the appointment, Sarah was smiling and asking if she could visit the kitten during her treatment stay at the clinic. What Sarah and her mother didn't realize was that Natasha's natural ability to communicate with frightened children came from experience comforting young civilians in war zones, and her expertise in treating trauma came from years of dealing with far worse injuries than kitten eye infections. But in that moment, surrounded by the gentle chaos of a small-town veterinary clinic, Natasha felt the same satisfaction she had once found in successful rescue missions. The lunch hour routine at Harmony Animal Hospital was sacred. Dr. Henley would close the clinic from 12 to 1 p.m., giving everyone time to eat and decompress before the afternoon appointment rush. Natasha usually spent this time walking to Riverside Park, 3 blocks away, where she would sit on her favorite bench overlooking Willow Pond and eat the sandwich she packed every morning. The park provided her with the closest thing to peace she had experienced since leaving military service. She would watch office workers from nearby businesses taking their lunch breaks, joggers completing their midday exercise routines, and mothers with young children feeding ducks at the pond's edge. The normalcy of these everyday activities served as both comfort and camouflage, allowing her to practice the art of being unremarkable while surrounded by people living genuinely unremarkable lives. Regular park visitors had come to recognize Natasha as part of the daily landscape. Harold Kowalski, a retired postal worker who fed the ducks every afternoon, would nod politely when their paths crossed. Jessica Park, a young mother who brought her toddler twins to play on the swings, occasionally exchanged pleasant small talk about the weather or the cute animals Natasha worked with at the clinic. These brief, friendly interactions represented everything Natasha was trying to build in her new life. No one looked at her with the mixture of respect and wariness that military personnel showed toward special operations veterans. No one asked questions about classified missions or wondered about the psychological cost of the work she had done. In Riverside Park, she was simply another working professional taking a peaceful lunch break, exactly as anonymous and unremarkable as she had worked so hard to become. The evening that would change everything began like hundreds of others before it. Natasha completed her shift at Harmony Animal Hospital at 5:45 p.m., helping Dr. Henley secure the building and ensure all overnight patients were comfortable for the evening. She had assisted with 2 routine vaccinations, a dental cleaning for an elderly golden retriever, and a minor surgery to remove a benign growth from a tabby cat named Mr. Whiskers. Nothing about the day had suggested that by nightfall she would be forced to confront the warrior she had spent 6 months trying to bury. After saying goodnight to Rebecca and Marcus, Natasha drove her Honda Civic to Crescent Mall for her weekly grocery shopping trip. She had established this routine as part of her civilian identity construction. Every Thursday evening, she would purchase supplies for the week, browse the small bookstore on the second level, and sometimes treat herself to coffee from the cafe near the main entrance. The predictability of this schedule made her feel grounded in her new life, while providing the structured routine her military-trained mind required to function in civilian society. Crescent Mall had been built in the 1980s and showed signs of its age, but it remained the primary shopping destination for Riverside's working-class residents. The anchor stores were a mid-level department store, a large grocery chain, and an electronics retailer that catered to budget-conscious families. Natasha preferred this environment to the upscale shopping centers in nearby Hillcrest because it allowed her to maintain her carefully constructed image as a modest veterinary assistant rather than someone with access to significant financial resources. Her shopping list that evening was typical: fresh vegetables for salads, lean proteins that would support her covert fitness regimen without seeming unusual for a health-conscious young professional, and ingredients for the homemade dog treats she made for the clinic's patients. She also needed to pick up a new romance novel, her cover hobby that had become a genuine source of relaxation, and replace the yoga mat that had finally worn out from her nightly practice sessions. The grocery store was moderately busy for a Thursday evening, filled with office workers stopping on their way home and families completing their weekly shopping. Natasha moved through the aisles with efficient purpose, selecting items while maintaining the situational awareness that had become second nature during her military service. She noted exit locations, observed other shoppers for any signs of unusual behavior, and unconsciously cataloged potential weapons among everyday items, habits that helped her feel secure while appearing to be nothing more than a thorough shopper. At the checkout counter, she exchanged pleasant small talk with Jennifer Walsh, a cashier who had come to recognize her weekly visits. Jennifer always commented on Natasha's healthy food choices and sometimes asked about interesting animals that had been treated at the clinic. These brief conversations had become important to Natasha because they represented normal social interactions with someone who saw her only as a friendly, regular customer. "How's that kitten doing?" Jennifer asked while scanning Natasha's yogurt and fresh spinach. "The one that little girl brought in with the eye infection?" Natasha had mentioned Sarah Chen's rescue kitten during a previous shopping trip, and Jennifer's genuine interest in the story reflected the kind of caring community connections that Natasha was learning to appreciate. "She's doing wonderful," Natasha replied with a genuine smile. Her eye healed completely, and Sarah named her Luna. They come in for checkups, and you can tell they're both crazy about each other. These conversations about her work allowed Natasha to share positive experiences while reinforcing her veterinary assistant identity with people who had no reason to question her background. After completing her shopping, Natasha browsed the bookstore and selected 2 romance novels that would help her practice emotional responses, different from the controlled reactions required in military operations. Reading about characters who solved problems through communication and relationship building rather than tactical planning and direct action served as a form of psychological training for civilian life. The mall began to quiet as stores prepared for closing time. Natasha made her way toward the parking garage, carrying her purchases in environmentally friendly bags that projected the image of a socially conscious young professional. The underground garage was poorly lit and had an echo that amplified every footstep, but she had parked there dozens of times without incident. Her Honda was located in Section C, near the stairs leading back to the main mall level. What Natasha couldn't know was that for 3 days, Derek Hawthorne had been studying her routine with the methodical attention of someone planning a crime. Derek was a career criminal with 2 previous robbery convictions who had been released from state prison 8 months earlier. His pattern was to observe potential victims for several days, noting their schedules, habits, and apparent vulnerability before selecting targets that promised maximum reward with minimum risk. Derek had chosen Natasha because everything about her suggested an easy mark. She shopped alone, drove an inexpensive car, dressed modestly, and appeared to be physically small and non-threatening. Her weekly routine made her predictable, and the underground parking garage provided an ideal location for robbery, isolated with multiple escape routes and minimal security camera coverage. Derek had recruited 2 associates, Tommy Rivera and Jake Morrison, both men with similar criminal backgrounds who were eager for what appeared to be guaranteed easy money. The 3 men had positioned themselves behind concrete support pillars in Section C, waiting for Natasha to return to her vehicle. They had observed her leaving the bookstore and calculated that she would reach the parking garage in approximately 4 minutes. Derek carried a knife, Tommy had brass knuckles, and Jake served as the lookout while planning to help subdue their victim if necessary. Their plan was straightforward. Approach from behind, strike quickly to disorient her, take her purse and any valuable items, and escape through the garage's rear exit before security or other shoppers could respond. Derek expected the entire robbery to take less than 2 minutes, based on his previous experience with similar crimes. He had no reason to suspect that their carefully selected victim was someone whose training had prepared her to respond to far more dangerous threats than 3 amateur criminals in a shopping mall parking garage. As Natasha's footsteps echoed through the concrete space, Derek signaled his accomplices and began moving from their concealed positions. In his mind, this was just another routine robbery that would net them several $100s and whatever credit cards they could use before the victim reported them stolen. He had absolutely no idea that he was about to attack someone whose reflexes, training, and psychological conditioning would transform their simple robbery attempt into the most dangerous mistake any of them had ever made. The moment Derek Hawthorne's fist connected with the side of Natasha's head, something fundamental shifted in the parking garage. The blow had been calculated to disorient and subdue what he believed was an ordinary woman. But as Natasha's body hit the concrete floor, her unconscious mind began processing the attack through neural pathways forged by 8 years of the most intensive combat training the United States military could provide. For exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Natasha's body lay motionless while her brain executed damage assessment protocols that had been drilled into her during countless training exercises. Her breathing remained shallow but controlled, her pulse elevated but steady. To the 3 men standing over her, she appeared to be completely unconscious, but her military-trained physiology was actually conducting a systematic evaluation of injuries, threat assessment, and tactical situation analysis. The blow that would have left most civilians concussed and disoriented had struck someone whose skull had been fractured by shrapnel during Operation Desert Storm and who had continued fighting for 6 hours before seeking medical attention. Derek's punch, while certainly painful, registered as minor trauma compared to the physical punishment Natasha had endured during SEER training, where she had learned to function effectively while subjected to physical abuse, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture designed to break enemy prisoners. While Derek, Tommy, and Jake congratulated themselves on their successful attack, Natasha's unconscious mind was cataloging every detail of their voices, movements, and positioning. Her ears tracked their footsteps as they moved around her body, noting that Derek remained near her head, Tommy had moved to her left side, and Jake was positioned near her feet. Her sense of smell detected cigarette smoke on Derek's clothing, alcohol on Tommy's breath, and the metallic scent of weapons that suggested at least one of them was carrying a knife. Her tactical assessment continued even while unconscious. The garage's acoustic properties would amplify any sounds of struggle, potentially attracting attention from mall security or late shoppers. The concrete floor provided solid footing for combat maneuvers, but would also cause significant injury if opponents were thrown against it. The lighting was poor enough to provide concealment for counterattacks, but sufficient for target identification. Emergency exit routes included the main vehicle entrance, 2 stairwells leading back to the mall, and a service corridor that connected to the adjacent office building. What the 3 criminals didn't understand was that Natasha's apparent vulnerability was actually a carefully maintained cover that had become instinctive after months of civilian life. Her petite frame and gentle demeanor weren't signs of weakness. They were camouflage that concealed someone whose body had been transformed into a precision weapon through years of specialized training that only a handful of women in military history had ever completed. During her time with Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Natasha had trained in close-quarters combat with instructors who were themselves legends in special operations communities. She had mastered fighting techniques from multiple martial arts disciplines, learning not just how to disable opponents, but how to do so with maximum efficiency while minimizing her own exposure to injury. Her small stature, which Derek had seen as a vulnerability, was actually an advantage in hand-to-hand combat because it lowered her center of gravity and made her a more difficult target. Her muscle memory contained responses to dozens of attack scenarios, each one practiced thousands of times until the movements became as automatic as breathing. She could disarm knife-wielding opponents, neutralize multiple attackers simultaneously, and transition between defensive and offensive postures faster than most people could process what was happening. More importantly, her psychological conditioning had eliminated the hesitation and fear responses that caused most civilians to freeze during violent encounters. As consciousness began returning to her conscious mind, Natasha's body remained perfectly still while her eyes moved beneath closed lids, processing the tactical situation with methodical precision. She could hear Derek's voice giving orders to his accomplices, Tommy's nervous laughter as he handled her purse, and Jake's footsteps as he maintained watch for potential witnesses. Their relaxed conversation told her they believed the threat assessment was complete, and they were now focused on collecting valuables rather than maintaining security. This was exactly the kind of overconfidence that had gotten enemy soldiers killed during her deployment operations. Natasha had learned that the moment opponents believed they had achieved victory was precisely when they became most vulnerable to counterattack. Their attention shifted from threat awareness to task completion. Their positioning became less tactical, and their psychological readiness for continued combat decreased dramatically. Her hands, which appeared to be lying limply at her sides, were actually positioned for maximum leverage if she needed to strike or grapple. Her legs, seemingly collapsed in an unconscious heap, were coiled and ready to deliver devastating kicks or to sweep opponents off their feet. Her breathing, while appearing shallow and labored, was actually the controlled respiration pattern she had used before engaging enemy targets during reconnaissance missions. The most dangerous element of Natasha's situation wasn't the physical threat posed by three amateur criminals. It was the psychological risk of allowing Lieutenant Commander Ghost Winters to emerge after 6 months of careful suppression. She had worked incredibly hard to bury the warrior identity that had defined her military career, learning to respond to problems with civilian solutions rather than tactical operations. But lying on that concrete floor, surrounded by men who intended to harm her, she could feel the familiar cold focus beginning to crystallize in her mind. Part of her consciousness remained Natasha, the veterinary assistant, the woman who spent her days healing injured animals and helping frightened children understand medical procedures. But another part, deeper and more fundamental, was waking up for the first time since her discharge from active duty. Ghost had been dormant but never destroyed, and the threat assessment protocols hardwired into her nervous system were preparing to take operational control. The three men standing over her unconscious form had no understanding of what they had awakened. They believed they had successfully neutralized a random civilian woman and were now free to complete their robbery without resistance. But they had actually triggered the activation of someone whose training had been specifically designed to turn physical vulnerability into tactical advantage. Someone whose apparent helplessness was about to become the most dangerous misunderstanding of their criminal careers. In 30 seconds, Derek Hawthorne would discover that appearances could be not just deceiving, but absolutely catastrophic. Derek Hawthorne reached down confidently toward Natasha's expensive watch, his mind already calculating the pawnshop value of the diamond-studded timepiece that caught the dim garage lighting. Behind him, Tommy Rivera was methodically emptying her purse onto the concrete floor, spreading out credit cards, cash, and identification with the casual efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Jake Morrison maintained his position near the garage entrance, occasionally glancing back to ensure their victim remained unconscious while keeping watch for any approaching vehicles or pedestrians. "Look at this," Tommy whispered, holding up her Platinum American Express card. "This chick's loaded. We hit the jackpot with this one." He began photographing her driver's license and credit cards with his phone, planning to sell the information to identity theft networks he had worked with during previous crimes. The address on her license confirmed what they had suspected. Hillcrest was one of Riverside's wealthiest neighborhoods, suggesting their victim had access to significant financial resources. Derek's fingers were inches from Natasha's wrist when he noticed something that should have sent alarm bells through his criminal instincts if he had possessed the experience to recognize what he was seeing. Her breathing wasn't quite right for someone who had been genuinely knocked unconscious by head trauma. The rhythm was too controlled, too steady, lacking the irregular patterns that typically followed concussive injuries. Her body position, while appearing collapsed and helpless, seemed somehow too balanced, as if she had fallen with unconscious grace rather than the awkward impact of true unconsciousness. But Derek's attention was focused entirely on the valuable items he was collecting, and his previous victims had all been genuinely helpless after similar attacks. He had no frame of reference for recognizing that he was looking at someone whose unconscious positioning was actually a carefully maintained tactical stance, someone whose apparent vulnerability was comprehensive camouflage for combat readiness that would have impressed his military instructors. Tommy discovered Natasha's work identification badge from Harmony Animal Hospital and laughed dismissively. "She's just a vet tech," he announced to his accomplices. "Probably makes like 30 grand a year, but she's spending money like she's rich. Must be daddy's credit cards or something." This assumption fit perfectly with their assessment of her as a spoiled rich girl who had never faced real danger, someone whose worst life experience had probably been a bad breakup or a failed college exam. Jake remained focused on security, but his positioning revealed the fundamental tactical error that amateur criminals typically made. All three men had clustered around their unconscious victim, abandoning the strategic positioning that would have protected them if she regained consciousness or if outside help arrived. Their formation created overlapping fields of responsibility and eliminated their ability to respond quickly to threats from multiple directions simultaneously. Derek's hand was almost touching Natasha's watch when he made his first serious mistake. Instead of simply removing the jewelry, he decided to check her pulse to ensure she remained unconscious, placing his fingers against her throat in a gesture that brought his face within 18 inches of hers. This was exactly the kind of overconfident behavior that got enemy soldiers killed during Natasha's special operations missions. The moment when tactical awareness gave way to task fixation, and opponents made themselves vulnerable to counterattack. What Derek felt wasn't the weak, rapid pulse of someone suffering from trauma and shock. Her heartbeat was strong, steady, and controlled, the cardiovascular response of someone whose body was prepared for immediate explosive action. But Derek had no medical training and no experience recognizing the physiological signs of controlled readiness versus genuine unconsciousness. He interpreted her strong pulse as a positive sign that she wouldn't die from his attack, which would have complicated their crime significantly. Tommy continued his inventory of stolen items, discovering expensive makeup, premium vitamins, and a smartphone that was clearly the latest model. Everything reinforced their impression of someone whose lifestyle far exceeded what a veterinary assistant should be able to afford. "She's definitely got rich parents or a sugar daddy," Tommy concluded, Nobody working with animals can afford this kind of stuff on their salary. The irony was devastating. Hidden in Natasha's wallet, beneath the civilian identification and credit cards, was a military ID that she kept for accessing Veterans Administration benefits. The card identified her as Lieutenant Commander Natasha Winters, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, with security clearances that would have horrified the three criminals if they had possessed any understanding of what those credentials represented. But Tommy was focused on immediately valuable items and discarded anything that didn't promise quick financial gain. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Jake made his first significant error by abandoning his security position to examine their victim more closely. "She's kind of pretty," he observed, his voice taking on a tone that suggested the robbery might expand to include additional crimes. "Maybe we should take her somewhere private before we're done here." This comment represented the escalation that would transform a simple robbery into something that demanded the most serious possible response from Natasha's deeply buried tactical conditioning. Derek straightened up from checking her pulse and nodded approvingly at Jake's suggestion. "Good thinking. We can use her ATM card to get cash, then have some fun before we let her go." The three men began discussing logistics for kidnapping their victim, completely unaware that their conversation was being processed by someone whose training had included resistance to interrogation, escape and evasion techniques, and psychological conditioning for surviving captivity. What they couldn't know was that their casual discussion of sexual assault had triggered protocols that went far deeper than simple self-defense. During her military service, Natasha had operated in regions where enemy forces routinely used sexual violence as a weapon of war, and her training had included specific instruction for preventing and responding to those threats. The mention of taking her somewhere private activated psychological conditioning that prioritized maximum aggression over minimum necessary force. Tommy finished photographing her identification and began collecting the scattered items to replace in her purse. "We should move fast," he advised. "Security might do a patrol sweep before the mall closes completely." His criminal experience was correct. They needed to complete their crime and evacuate before mall security conducted final checks of the parking areas. But their timeline had just accelerated, beyond their ability to control. Derek reached again for Natasha's watch, and this time his fingers actually made contact with the leather strap. The touch was light, careful, intended to avoid waking her while he removed the valuable jewelry. But physical contact with someone who intended sexual assault triggered the final layer of Natasha's psychological conditioning. The protocols that had been designed to ensure that captured special operations personnel would never surrender without extracting maximum casualties from their captors. Lieutenant Commander Ghost Winters was about to return to active duty. Natasha's eyes snapped open with the crystalline clarity of a predator that had been feigning death while calculating the perfect moment to strike. Derek Hawthorne found himself staring into pupils that reflected none of the confusion, fear, or disorientation he expected to see in a recently unconscious robbery victim. Instead, he was looking at the focused intensity of someone whose mind had spent the last 4 minutes conducting tactical analysis while her body prepared for combat operations. The transformation was so complete and so immediate that Derek's brain struggled to process what he was seeing. The delicate, vulnerable woman who had been unconscious moments before was now radiating a controlled menace that seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the parking garage. Her breathing had shifted from the shallow gasps of trauma to the deep, measured rhythm of someone oxygenating their system for physical exertion. Her facial expression carried the cold calculation of a professional who had evaluated the tactical situation and found her opponents severely wanting. "Gentlemen," Natasha said, in a voice that bore no resemblance to the soft tones her veterinary clinic colleagues would have recognized, "you've made a serious error in target selection." Her words carried the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders in life-or-death situations, and the casual politeness somehow made the statement infinitely more threatening than any screamed curse or panicked plea would have been. Derek's hand was still touching her watch when Natasha's left arm moved with mechanical precision, her fingers clamping down on his wrist with crushing force that immediately cut off circulation to his hand. The pressure she applied targeted nerve clusters that most people didn't know existed, sending electric pain shooting up his arm while simultaneously paralyzing his grip. Derek tried to pull away but found his wrist trapped in what felt like a mechanical vice, operated by someone who understood exactly how much force to apply to cause maximum pain without permanent damage. Tommy Rivera dropped Natasha's scattered belongings and fumbled for the brass knuckles in his jacket pocket, his movements clumsy with surprise and growing panic. "She's awake!" he shouted unnecessarily, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Derek, she's awake and she's—" His words were cut off as he realized that Derek wasn't responding to his alarm, because Derek was currently experiencing pain levels that made coherent thought impossible. Jake Morrison abandoned his position near the entrance and moved toward the struggle, pulling a folding knife from his pocket with hands that trembled slightly as adrenaline and confusion flooded his system. "Let him go, bitch," he snarled, trying to project the intimidating aggression that had worked during previous robberies. "Let him go, or I'll cut you up." The knife blade reflected the dim garage lighting as Jake attempted to position himself for an attack that would force their victim to release Derek. Natasha's response was to apply additional pressure to Derek's wrist while simultaneously shifting her body weight in preparation for a movement that would address multiple threats sequentially. Her years of close-quarters combat training had included extensive work against multiple armed opponents, and she was automatically prioritizing targets based on immediate threat level, weapon capabilities, and positioning relative to cover and escape routes. "I'm going to explain this once," Natasha continued, in the same unnaturally calm voice, her eyes moving between Tommy and Jake while maintaining crushing pressure on Derek's trapped wrist. "You attacked the wrong person on the wrong day in the wrong place. Your best option at this point is to walk away immediately and pretend this never happened." Her tone suggested she was offering genuine advice rather than making threats, which somehow made her words infinitely more ominous. Derek managed to gasp out a response through the waves of pain radiating from his crushed wrist. You're just some vet tech. Let me go, or my boys will—" His attempt at maintaining criminal authority was cut short as Natasha increased the pressure enough to make his vision blur and his knees buckle. The casual ease with which she controlled his pain levels suggested an understanding of human anatomy that went far beyond basic first aid training. Tommy finally managed to get his brass knuckles positioned and took a step toward the struggle, raising his fist to strike at Natasha's head. "I'm going to knock you out for real this time," he announced, telegraphing his attack with the kind of obvious preparation that would have gotten him killed instantly during actual combat. His movement pattern, his stance, and his breathing all broadcast his intentions with the subtlety of a marching band. Natasha's response demonstrated why naval special warfare training emphasized speed and precision over brute force. Without releasing Derek's wrist, she used her right leg to sweep Tommy's feet out from under him, sending him crashing to the concrete floor with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs and send his brass knuckles skittering across the garage floor. The movement was so fluid and economical that it appeared almost casual, as if she was brushing aside an annoying insect rather than neutralizing an armed attacker. Jake watched his accomplice hit the ground and felt the first genuine fear he had experienced since beginning his criminal career. The woman they had targeted for an easy robbery was displaying combat skills that belonged in action movies, not in shopping mall parking garages. Her movements were precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective in ways that suggested professional training far beyond civilian self-defense classes. "This is impossible," Jake muttered, his knife hand wavering as he tried to process what he was witnessing. She works at an animal hospital. This doesn't make sense." His criminal experience had never included opponents who could disable multiple attackers while maintaining conversational tone and perfect situational awareness. Derek's face was gray with pain and shock as circulation to his hand was completely cut off by Natasha's grip. "Please," he whispered, abandoning all pretense of criminal authority. "Please let me go. We'll leave. We'll never bother you again." The physical agony was overwhelming, but even more disturbing was his growing realization that their victim was demonstrating capabilities that suggested she could do far worse things to them if she chose to escalate her response. Natasha studied Derek's face with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating an opponent's psychological condition for intelligence value. "That's the first intelligent thing any of you have said tonight," she observed. "But unfortunately, you've already crossed several lines that make simply walking away complicated." Her analysis of the situation included their discussion of kidnapping and sexual assault, crimes that activated protocols requiring more definitive responses than simple deterrence. Tommy struggled to catch his breath while Jake continued to hold his knife in an increasingly uncertain grip, both men beginning to understand that they had stumbled into a situation that was far beyond their experience or abilities to control. The petite veterinary assistant they had targeted for a routine robbery was revealing herself to be something entirely different, something that belonged in a world of violence and professional competence that they had never imagined encountering during their criminal careers. The parking garage had become a classroom, and these three men were about to receive an education in the difference between predators and apex predators. Jake Morrison's knife trembled in his grip as he stared at the scene unfolding before him. His criminal instincts, honed through years of successful robberies, were screaming that something fundamental had changed in the power dynamic of their carefully planned crime. The woman who should have been their helpless victim was demonstrating control over Derek that seemed almost supernatural, maintaining crushing pressure on his wrist, while speaking with the casual authority of someone discussing weekend plans. "I need you to listen very carefully," Natasha continued, her voice carrying the patient tone of an instructor explaining a complex concept to slow students. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Natasha Winters, United States Navy, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. My military designation was SEAL Team 6, and my operational call sign was Ghost." She paused to let this information penetrate their panic-clouded minds. "Do any of those terms mean anything to you?" Tommy Rivera, still gasping for breath on the concrete floor, looked up with confusion and growing terror. Navy SEALs were legendary, even among criminals who had spent time in federal prison. Stories circulated through correctional facilities about special operations soldiers whose capabilities bordered on superhuman, warriors who could eliminate entire enemy units without making a sound. But those were supposed to be men, elite male soldiers who operated in foreign war zones, not petite women working at suburban animal hospitals. "That's impossible," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Navy SEALs are all men. Everyone knows that. You're lying to try to scare us." But even as he spoke, Jake was noticing details that his adrenaline-clouded mind had missed during their initial attack. The way she controlled Derek's wrist demonstrated knowledge of pressure points and joint manipulation that seemed far beyond civilian self-defense training. Her positioning allowed her to monitor all three attackers simultaneously while maintaining tactical advantages that suggested professional military instruction. Natasha smiled with the patient expression of someone who had dealt with skepticism about her credentials many times during her military career. "You're partially correct," she acknowledged. For most of Navy SEAL history, the program was exclusively male, but in 2016, the Department of Defense opened all combat positions to women who could meet the same standards as male candidates. Her grip on Derek's wrist shifted slightly, demonstrating that she could increase his pain dramatically without apparent effort. "I was the fourth woman to complete SEAL training successfully, and the only one to serve operationally with DevGru." Derek's face was approaching the gray pallor of someone experiencing severe circulatory compromise, but his eyes showed the dawning recognition of someone beginning to understand the magnitude of their error. Even through waves of pain, fragments of news stories were filtering back to him. Reports about female soldiers joining elite units, congressional debates about women in combat roles, scattered mentions of classified operations involving female special operations personnel. DevGru is what most people call SEAL Team 6, Natasha continued, apparently enjoying the educational opportunity. "We handle the missions that are too sensitive or too dangerous for regular SEAL teams. Hostage rescues, counterterrorism operations, high-value target elimination." Her tone remained conversational, but the specific military terminology was having a profound psychological effect on her three attackers, who were beginning to realize they had chosen to rob someone whose job description had included killing enemy soldiers. Tommy managed to sit up partially, his breathing still labored from having the wind knocked out of him. "Even if that's true," he said desperately, "you're not in the military anymore. You work at an animal hospital. You can't hurt us. This is civilian life. There are laws." His attempt to assert legal protections revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that many criminals maintained about how violence actually worked in the real world. Jake was studying Natasha's positioning and movements with growing appreciation for her tactical advantages. She had maintained control of Derek while keeping both remaining attackers in her peripheral vision, positioned herself near cover provided by a concrete support pillar, and remained between them and the most direct escape route to the main garage entrance. Every aspect of her current situation suggested someone with extensive training in close-quarters combat scenarios. "You're absolutely right about civilian law," Natasha agreed. "But here's what you may not understand about legal self-defense standards." She shifted her weight slightly, a movement that caused Derek to whimper as pressure on his wrist increased. When three men attack a woman in an isolated location and then discuss kidnapping and sexual assault, the legal system becomes very generous about what constitutes reasonable force in response. The mention of their earlier conversation about taking her somewhere private sent fresh waves of panic through all three men. They had assumed their unconscious victim couldn't hear their planning, but if she had been conscious and listening, their casual discussion of additional crimes had legally escalated the situation far beyond simple robbery. Sexual assault charges carried decades-long prison sentences, and their recorded conversation would provide prosecutors with clear evidence of premeditated intent. "Look," Jake said, lowering his knife slightly as he attempted to negotiate, "maybe we can work something out here. We made a mistake. We thought you were just some regular person. If you let Derek go, we'll walk away and never mention this to anyone." His offer revealed the desperation of someone who was beginning to understand that their simple robbery had transformed into a potential life-threatening encounter with a professional soldier. Natasha tilted her head as if considering his proposal, but her expression suggested she found his negotiation attempt amusing rather than compelling. "That's a reasonable offer," she acknowledged, "but it doesn't address the fundamental problem we're facing here." She glanced meaningfully at the security camera mounted in the corner of the parking garage, its red recording light visible even in the dim lighting. "This entire incident is being documented by mall security systems." The revelation about surveillance cameras hit the three criminals like physical blows. Security footage would provide prosecutors with video evidence of their attack, Natasha's defensive response, and their current attempts to negotiate their way out of criminal liability. Even if they convinced her to release Derek and allow them to leave, the recorded evidence would still result in assault charges, attempted robbery convictions, and potentially additional charges related to their discussion of sexual assault. Tommy struggled to his feet, his movements unsteady as he tried to process the implications of their situation. "The cameras," he said numbly. "They recorded everything. Even if we run now, they'll have our faces." His criminal experience had taught him that security footage was often the evidence that sent robbers to prison for extended sentences, especially when combined with victim testimony about their methods and intentions. Derek's attempts to speak were becoming increasingly incoherent as pain and oxygen deprivation affected his cognitive function. "Please," he managed to whisper, "I can't. My hand. Please, let me go. We'll do anything you want." His complete surrender represented the psychological breaking point that Natasha had been systematically engineering through controlled application of pain and superior tactical positioning. Jake looked from the security camera to Natasha's confident expression to Derek's deteriorating condition and felt the crushing weight of realization settling over him. They had attacked someone whose training had prepared her for far worse situations than three amateur criminals in a shopping mall parking garage. Their simple robbery had become a demonstration of why professional soldiers were considered apex predators in the human hierarchy of violence. The knife in Jake's hand suddenly felt like a child's toy rather than a weapon, and for the first time in his criminal career, he found himself wondering whether he was about to become a casualty rather than a perpetrator. The transformation in the parking garage atmosphere was complete as Natasha's true identity settled into the minds of her three attackers, like a slow-acting poison. Derek's whimpering had become a steady background noise punctuated by his desperate attempts to beg for release, while Tommy and Jake stood frozen in the growing realization that they had stumbled into a situation that their criminal experience had never prepared them to handle. Natasha released Derek's wrist with surgical precision, allowing blood flow to return gradually rather than all at once, preventing the additional shock that could have caused him to lose consciousness. Derek collapsed immediately, cradling his damaged hand against his chest, while tears of pain and terror streamed down his face. The controlled manner of his release demonstrated the same professional competence that had characterized every aspect of Natasha's response, calculated, measured, and designed to achieve specific tactical objectives. "Now that I have your complete attention," Natasha said, rising to her feet with fluid grace that belied the violence she had just demonstrated, "we need to discuss how this situation is going to resolve." She brushed dust from her sundress with casual movements that somehow made her appear even more dangerous, as if physical combat was so routine for her that it barely qualified as noteworthy activity. Jake still held his knife, but his grip had become uncertain as he processed the implications of attacking someone with Lieutenant Commander Natasha's military background. Stories about Navy SEAL capabilities weren't just military legend. They were documented reality that included hand-to-hand combat training against multiple armed opponents, weapons expertise that spanned everything from knives to explosives, and psychological conditioning that eliminated normal fear responses during life-threatening encounters. "Here's what's going to happen," Natasha continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had briefed military units before dangerous operations. "Tommy is going to remain sitting exactly where he is. Jake is going to place his knife on the ground and step away from it. Derek is going to continue learning about the consequences of poor decision-making." Her instructions were delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance, as if disobedience wasn't even a possibility worth considering. Tommy nodded frantically from his position on the concrete floor, making no attempt to rise or move closer to his scattered brass knuckles. The sweep that had put him down had been executed with enough force to remind him that Natasha could easily escalate her response if any of them tested her patience further. "We'll do whatever you say," he said quickly. "We don't want any more trouble. We just want to get out of here." Jake's internal struggle was visible on his face as he weighed his options with increasing desperation. Running wasn't realistic because Natasha had positioned herself between him and the exit, and her demonstrated speed suggested she could catch him before he reached his vehicle. Fighting seemed suicidal given her obvious combat training and the ease with which she had neutralized Derek. Negotiation was his only remaining option, but her military bearing suggested someone accustomed to dictating terms rather than accepting them. "What do you want?" Jake asked, slowly lowering his knife toward the ground while keeping his eyes fixed on Natasha's face. "Money? We can get you money. Information. We know other people, other criminals you might be looking for." His desperate attempts to find something valuable to offer revealed how completely their power dynamic had reversed from the initial robbery scenario. Natasha watched Jake place his knife on the concrete and step away from it before responding to his question. "What I want," she said thoughtfully, "is to understand how 3 grown men convinced themselves that attacking random women in parking garages was an acceptable way to earn money." Her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than moral judgment, as if she was conducting a psychological assessment for intelligence-gathering purposes. Derek had managed to stop crying long enough to attempt speech, though his voice was weak and shaky from pain and shock. "We didn't know," he whispered. We thought it would be easy. We've done this before, and it's always been easy." His admission revealed the pattern of criminal behavior that had led them to target Natasha, while simultaneously confirming that they were repeat offenders whose previous victims had been genuinely helpless civilians. "That's the interesting part," Natasha observed. "You've apparently been successful enough at this to develop confidence in your methods, which means there are other women who didn't have the training necessary to defend themselves against your attacks." Her analysis was leading toward implications that made all 3 men increasingly uncomfortable as they realized their past crimes were being evaluated by someone whose moral framework had been shaped by military service. Tommy shifted nervously on the ground as he began to understand the direction of Natasha's questioning. "Look, we never really hurt anyone before," he said defensively. "We just took their money and left them alone. Nobody ever got seriously injured or anything." His attempt to minimize their previous crimes revealed the self-serving rationalization that many career criminals use to justify their choice of victims. Jake nodded eagerly in agreement with Tommy's characterization. "He's right. We're not violent criminals. We're just opportunists. We see someone who looks like they have money. We take it. Everyone goes home safe." His description of their robbery methods as non-violent demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how their victims had experienced being attacked and threatened in isolated locations. Natasha's expression grew colder as she processed their explanations. "You attacked me from behind without warning, discussed kidnapping me for sexual assault, and you consider that non-violent behavior. Her voice carried the controlled anger of someone who had seen real violence and understood the psychological trauma that criminal attacks inflicted on innocent victims. Every woman you've robbed has probably experienced nightmares, anxiety, and fear for months or years after your non-violent encounters. The security implications of their conversation were becoming increasingly complex as Natasha realized she was dealing with serial offenders whose criminal activities had affected multiple victims. Her military training had included instruction in intelligence gathering and criminal investigation techniques, and she was automatically cataloging information that could be valuable to law enforcement agencies investigating unsolved robbery cases throughout the Riverside area. Derek managed to raise his head enough to look at Natasha with desperate eyes. "What are you going to do to us?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The question carried weight beyond immediate physical concern, because all three men were beginning to understand that their encounter with Lieutenant Commander Ghost Winters was going to have consequences that extended far beyond this parking garage. Natasha smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone who had just realized she was in a position to solve a problem that extended far beyond her personal situation. "That's an excellent question," she said, "and the answer is going to depend entirely on how cooperative you gentlemen decide to be over the next few minutes." The fluorescent lighting hummed overhead as three career criminals found themselves completely at the mercy of someone whose idea of justice had been shaped by military operations in places where mercy was a luxury that professional soldiers couldn't afford to offer. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the parking garage as mall security guard Robert Chen made his routine final patrol before the facility's official closing time. His flashlight beam swept across empty parking spaces and concrete pillars as he conducted the standard security check that he had performed hundreds of times over his 3 years of employment at Crescent Mall. What Robert couldn't see from his position near the main entrance was the life-changing encounter taking place in Section C, where 4 people were having a conversation that would reshape their understanding of justice, consequences, and the hidden depths that exist within ordinary-seeming individuals. Natasha heard the security guards approach long before her 3 attackers became aware of his presence, her military-trained hearing automatically cataloging the steady rhythm of his footsteps, the metallic jingle of keys on his belt, and the electronic crackle of his radio communication device. Her tactical assessment of the new variable was instantaneous. Additional witness, potential assistance, possible complications for evidence preservation, and opportunity for official documentation of criminal behavior. "We have company arriving," Natasha announced quietly to Derek, Tommy, and Jake, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had coordinated with law enforcement and security personnel during countless military operations. "This presents you gentlemen with a choice that will determine how the rest of your lives unfold." Her statement was delivered with the matter-of-fact precision of someone presenting tactical options to subordinates before a mission. Derek, still cradling his damaged wrist, looked toward the approaching footsteps with a mixture of hope and terror. Part of him wanted to call for help from the security guard, but another part understood that official intervention would result in police reports, criminal charges, and the kind of legal consequences that could send him back to prison for decades. His previous convictions meant that any new felony charges would trigger habitual offender statutes that carried mandatory life sentences. Tommy remained frozen on the concrete floor, his mind racing through scenarios that all seemed to end with him in handcuffs. The brass knuckles he had dropped were visible evidence of his intent to commit aggravated assault, while the security camera footage would document every aspect of their attack on Natasha. Even if she chose not to press charges, the video evidence could still result in prosecution under state laws that didn't require victim cooperation for assault cases. Jake found himself studying Natasha's face for clues about her intentions as the security guard's footsteps grew closer. Her expression revealed nothing beyond professional assessment of the tactical situation, but her military bearing suggested someone who understood the legal system well enough to navigate complex evidence preservation and criminal prosecution procedures. Her cooperation with law enforcement could transform their simple robbery attempt into a comprehensive investigation that might solve multiple unsolved cases. "Officer Chen," Natasha called out as the security guard's flashlight beam swept into their section of the garage, her voice projecting the confidence of someone accustomed to working with law enforcement personnel. "I need to report an attempted robbery and assault." Her decision to involve official authorities eliminated any possibility that the three criminals could negotiate their way out of legal consequences. Robert Chen redirected his flashlight toward the group and immediately recognized that he was looking at something far more serious than the typical parking garage incidents he usually encountered. The woman who had called his name was standing with military posture while three men appeared to be in various states of distress or submission. His training had taught him to recognize crime scenes, and everything about the tableau suggested he had discovered either a robbery in progress or its immediate aftermath. "Ma'am, are you injured?" Robert asked, approaching with appropriate caution while keeping his radio ready to call for police backup. His flashlight illuminated Derek's pale face and cradled wrist, Tommy's position on the ground, and Jake's abandoned knife, providing visual confirmation that violence had recently occurred. "Do you need medical attention or immediate police assistance?" Natasha's response demonstrated the systematic thoroughness that had characterized her military service. "I'm uninjured, but we need police response for assault, attempted robbery, and conspiracy charges against these three individuals," she said, gesturing toward her attackers with professional precision. "There's security camera footage of the entire incident, and I can provide detailed statements about their criminal methods and previous admissions of similar crimes." Derek's hope that the security guard might somehow rescue him from his situation evaporated as he realized that Natasha was actively cooperating with law enforcement rather than trying to de-escalate the confrontation. "Please," he said desperately to Robert Chen, "we made a mistake. We're sorry. We just want to leave and never come back." His plea revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that many criminals maintained about how the legal system responded to violent crimes. Robert's training had included procedures for securing crime scenes and managing multiple suspects until police arrived. "Everyone needs to remain exactly where they are," he announced, unclipping his radio to request immediate police response. "Nobody moves until officers arrive to sort this out." His authoritative tone reflected years of experience dealing with mall security incidents, though nothing in his background had prepared him for managing suspects who had attacked a former Navy SEAL. Tommy attempted to sit up more comfortably, but froze when Natasha's eyes fixed on him with unmistakable warning. "The lady said not to move," Robert added, recognizing that the woman seemed to have established control over the situation before his arrival. "Just stay put and keep your hands where I can see them." His instinctive trust in Natasha's authority suggested that her military bearing was communicating competence even to civilians who didn't understand her background. Jake watched Robert call for police backup and felt the final vestiges of hope drain from his body. "This is going to destroy our lives," he said to no one in particular, his voice carrying the defeated tone of someone who was beginning to calculate prison sentences and legal costs. "We're going to spend the next 20 years in jail because we picked the wrong person to rob." Natasha's response revealed the broader perspective that came with military service and an understanding of how criminal behavior affected entire communities. "Your lives were already destroyed by the choices you made," she said matter-of-factly. "I'm just the person who's going to ensure you face consequences for those choices." Her tone suggested that she viewed their legal prosecution as a necessary public service rather than personal revenge. Robert's radio crackled with confirmation that multiple police units were en route to Crescent Mall with an estimated arrival time of 6 minutes. "Officers are coming," he announced to the group. "Detective units and evidence technicians will be here shortly after patrol units secure the scene." His professional competence in managing the situation was clearly reassuring to Natasha, who nodded approvingly at his efficient handling of procedures. Derek made one final attempt at negotiation, his voice weak with pain and desperation. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, using her military title in hopes of appealing to professional courtesy, "isn't there some way we can resolve this without involving the courts? We could provide information about other criminals, help solve other cases, do community service." His offer revealed both his understanding that she held complete power over his future and his growing recognition that standard criminal negotiation tactics were useless against someone with her background. Natasha considered his proposal with the same analytical approach she brought to all tactical decisions. "You're going to provide that information anyway," she replied calmly, "during police interrogation, plea bargain negotiations, and cooperation agreements with prosecutors. The difference is that you'll be doing it from jail instead of from freedom." Her response demonstrated the comprehensive understanding of criminal justice procedures that came with military intelligence training and cooperation with federal law enforcement agencies. The distant sound of police sirens began echoing through the mall complex as Robert Chen maintained his professional vigilance over the crime scene. In 6 minutes, 3 career criminals would begin learning about the consequences of underestimating a woman whose quiet demeanor concealed 8 years of the most advanced combat training the United States military could provide. Their education was about to become very expensive indeed. The arrival of Riverside Police Department units transformed the Crescent Mall parking garage into a carefully orchestrated crime scene processing operation that would be referenced in law enforcement training materials for years to come. Detective Sarah Martinez, a 15-year veteran with extensive experience in violent crime investigation, took one look at the scene and immediately recognized that she was dealing with something extraordinary. The professional manner in which the suspects had been contained, the pristine preservation of evidence, and the military bearing of the victim suggested a level of competence that exceeded typical civilian crime scenarios. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Martinez," she said, approaching Natasha with the respectful tone reserved for witnesses whose credibility and cooperation would be essential for successful prosecution. "Officer Chen has provided a preliminary briefing, but I need to hear your account of what happened here tonight." Her notebook was ready, but her attention was focused on Natasha's demeanor, which radiated the calm confidence of someone accustomed to providing official testimony. Natasha's statement was delivered with the systematic precision that had characterized her military debriefings after classified operations. She provided exact timeline information, detailed descriptions of each attacker's actions and statements, and specific references to the security camera angles that would have captured different phases of the assault. Her testimony included verbatim quotes of the criminal's discussion about kidnapping and sexual assault, information that immediately elevated the charges from simple robbery to felony conspiracy with special circumstances. The suspects identified themselves as repeat offenders during their conversation while they believed I was unconscious, Natasha continued. her voice carrying the professional objectivity of someone presenting intelligence findings. Derek Hawthorne specifically stated, "We've done this before and it's always been easy," while Tommy Rivera expressed familiarity with identity theft networks for credit card fraud. Their methods suggest a pattern of targeting women in isolated locations. Detective Martinez's expression grew increasingly serious as she realized the investigation was likely to connect multiple unsolved cases throughout the Riverside area. Criminal pattern analysis would now focus on shopping mall parking garages, victims matching Natasha's demographic profile, and robbery methods consistent with the suspect's documented behavior. The detectives' preliminary assessment suggested they had captured criminals whose activities had probably affected dozens of victims over an extended period. Derek Hawthorne was transported to Riverside General Hospital under police guard for treatment of what medical personnel would later document as severe nerve damage to his wrist, caused by precise application of pressure to specific anatomical points. The emergency room physician, Dr. Amanda Foster, had never seen injuries consistent with military combat techniques applied in civilian settings. Her medical report would describe tissue damage that demonstrated professional knowledge of human anatomy and pressure point manipulation. Tommy Rivera and Jake Morrison were processed at Riverside Police Department headquarters, where their booking photographs and fingerprint analysis revealed extensive criminal histories spanning multiple states. Tommy's previous convictions included 3 aggravated robbery charges and 2 assault cases, while Jake's record documented a progression from petty theft to increasingly violent crimes over an 8-year period. Both men would face habitual offender charges that carried potential life sentences. The security camera footage from Crescent Mall provided prosecutors with evidence that exceeded their expectations for visual documentation of criminal behavior. The high-definition recording captured Derek's initial attack, Natasha's professional response, and clear audio of the criminal's discussion about kidnapping and sexual assault. Legal experts would later describe the video evidence as the most comprehensive documentation of attempted violent crime in departmental history. Natasha's cooperation with the investigation extended far beyond her role as victim and witness. Her military background had included training in criminal investigation techniques, intelligence, analysis, and federal law enforcement cooperation procedures. She worked with Detective Martinez to develop criminal profile information that would assist in connecting their case to unsolved robberies throughout the region, potentially providing closure for victims who had never expected their attackers to face justice. The media attention surrounding the case focused initially on the dramatic contrast between Natasha's civilian occupation and her military background, but gradually shifted toward broader discussions about hidden heroes working in ordinary jobs throughout American communities. Local news coverage emphasized her choice to return to quiet civilian service rather than capitalizing on her military achievements, presenting her story as an example of authentic heroism that preferred substance over recognition. 6 months after the arrests, Derek Hawthorne accepted a plea bargain that resulted in a 25-year prison sentence in exchange for providing information about 17 additional robbery victims and 3 accomplices who had participated in previous crimes. His cooperation led to the solution of cases dating back 4 years, providing closure for families who had begun to believe their attackers would never be identified. Tommy Rivera chose to fight the charges at trial, where security camera footage and Natasha's testimony resulted in conviction on all counts, including conspiracy to commit sexual assault. His habitual offender status triggered an automatic life sentence without possibility of parole. Defense attorneys would later cite his case as an example of how modern surveillance technology and competent witnesses had made traditional criminal defense strategies obsolete. Jake Morrison's legal strategy focused on cooperation with federal authorities, investigating organized crime networks that specialized in identity theft and credit card fraud. His information led to arrests in 7 states and the dismantling of criminal organizations that had caused millions of dollars in financial losses. His cooperation earned him a reduced sentence of 18 years, though prosecutors noted that his rehabilitation prospects remained questionable. Natasha returned to her position at Harmony Animal Hospital, where her colleagues gradually learned about her extraordinary background through carefully managed conversations rather than media attention. Dr. Patricia Henley later observed that understanding Natasha's military service helped explain her exceptional competence during medical emergencies and her natural ability to provide comfort to traumatized animals and their owners. The case became a landmark example in law enforcement training curricula, demonstrating how military veterans could provide exceptional assistance during civilian criminal investigations. Police academies throughout the state began including scenarios based on Natasha's response to multiple attackers, while prosecutor training programs used the case to illustrate effective witness preparation and evidence presentation techniques. 2 years later, Natasha received a letter from Sarah Chen, the 8-year-old girl whose kitten Luna had been treated at the clinic. Sarah's letter, written in careful second-grade handwriting, thanked Natasha for making Luna better and announced that Sarah wanted to become a veterinarian when she grew up, "So I can help animals like you do." The letter reminded Natasha that her greatest victory wasn't neutralizing 3 criminals in a parking garage, but inspiring a child to choose healing over harm as her life's mission. Today, Natasha continues working at Harmony Animal Hospital, treating injured pets and comforting anxious owners with the same quiet competence that once characterized her military service. She drives the same modest Honda Civic, lives in the same apartment, and maintains the same carefully ordinary routine that had made her invisible to everyone except 3 criminals who learned too late that appearances can be more than deceiving. They can be absolutely catastrophic for anyone foolish enough to underestimate what lies beneath the surface. The story of Lieutenant Commander Ghost Winters serves as a reminder that heroes walk among us in the most unlikely places, that strength doesn't always announce itself, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one most capable of protecting everyone else when protection becomes necessary. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.